Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see the numbers of participants ticking up rapidly. I think just past the 100, rapidly up to 150 mark. So we're just going to let people sign in, give people a quick minute to do that. And whilst doing that, if you'd like to take the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Always lovely to know who's on the call. You can tell us where you're calling in from. We can award prizes to the furthest away. Although I suppose this day and age doesn't really matter where you are with the miracles of Zoom and the internet. I usually ask for a weather report as well, so you can give us a bit of an insight to what's going on around the country. So that's yeah, just use the chat function for that. Catherine's first in from Ricardo, rainy South Wales. Okay, that's one of my colleagues, Madeline, in introducing these sessions, decided to trump me and ask people for their best. It was a session about storage, their best joke, their best energy storage joke, and then told an energy storage joke. But you'll be relieved that I'm not going to do that. Or, well, if you want to have a go at your best energy joke in the chat, then be my guest. But maybe you'd just like to tell us where you're from. So we've got Anglesey, Laura next, Scottish Future Trust in a grey, Edinburgh. Yeah, Bath's pretty grey, that's where I'm from as well, though I'm based as well. North East Hampshire. Dickon from South Devon. Hi, Dickon. We've got Manchester, Camden, Mac. Well, I've got someone from Hamburg. That's the winner so far for the furthest away distance. Great. Okay, well, we're over the 200 mark of participants, so I think we shall kick off and make a start and try and keep time. We've only got an hour and a half, and we've got a big topic to discuss today. So welcome everyone to this Regen webinar event on the government's call for evidence on enabling a high renewables net zero electricity system. This is a current call for evidence. It's out on the 8th of, it's out now, and it closes on the 8th of March. And this is obviously something which is sort of bang in Regen's sweet spot. This is exactly the kind of topic that we've been working on and debate a lot within our team and offices. You know, how do we get from where we all started a few years ago, a decade ago, we were down at just a few percent. We were down at the days when Boris Johnson felt that wind power couldn't tear the skin off a rice pudding, and now, you know, we're at a point where wind is front and center of a Tory party conference. It's front page of the Daily Mail, and never thought I'd see that. And I think in 2020 we are at around the 40% of our electricity coming from renewables. So the question is, how do we get from there? How do we get the rest of the way, essentially? So, as I say, this is really bang on Regen's sweet spot. Our mission, as I think most of you have a pretty good idea, is about accelerating that transformation of the energy system as a whole, to net zero. And these kind of key issues, key areas of government policy, markets and regulation, and how we set up our energy system, are where we, working with our membership, spend a lot of our time and effort to try and use our expertise, our knowledge of the system, to work with our members to try and help shape public policy so that we get to the best possible place, and we get on track fundamentally for achieving our net zero goals. So welcome to many of you on the call today who are already members, but put in our first plug at the beginning, say that if you're not, then we'd love to have you, and you can find out more on the website. I can imagine Rachel, our producer, will put a link in the chat as well, and you can follow up with her or the team afterwards. So, as I say, exactly the kind of area Regen is focused on and working on. And so great to see the government putting out this call for evidence. And there's some fascinating questions in it. You know, there are questions that go right to the heart of, do we have the right systems, the right markets, the right structures to enable the volume of investment we're going to need in renewable energy? I think the energy white paper talks about 4 times more renewables than we currently have as required for net zero, and you can argue about the exact numbers, but one way or another, it's a great deal of work, investment required, and it needs to happen at speed and at scale. This is a critical area, and the aim today is to go deep into that. So to engage our full out energy system, what's the right phrase? Geekiness, whatever you like. So if you signed on for the quick overview, the summary, the achieving high renewables for dummies, then you might want to switch off now and go. I'm sure there's plenty out there catering for you. This is going to be, we're going to aiming to go deep into some of the details of the energy system that I'm sure you'll all have a lot to contribute. So in doing that, our agenda today, relatively straightforward approach. So we have our colleagues from BEIS, Tom and Suleiman, are going to be talking us through the consultation to kick us off, kind of warm us up. And then what we thought we'd do is have some responses, if you like, some sort of commentary from a number of industry players and commentators. And we've tried to deliberately choose people coming from different perspectives. I'll introduce them you can see them on the agenda, and I'll introduce them as we come to that bit. So we'll ask them to be fairly quick fire in their responses, and then we're going to open up for a panel discussion. And at that point, you can use the Q&A function to throw in the kind of questions you want to ask. Now we're up to about 250 people so far, so I'm afraid we're not going to be able to sort of take everyone's questions one-on-one, but if you chuck them into the Q&A, then I and the panelists can all see those, and we can try and kind of ensure that we're talking about the right themes. And the themes that you guys are really interested in. And then please feel free to carry on using the chat function to kind of talk to throw in interesting links or things that you put in your perspective and views, and we'll have a look at that afterwards. You can all look at it, and we'll also provide our colleagues at BEIS with a copy, in case they want to scroll through that. Great. Okay, so that's the session. We're aiming for a 3:30, so quite a lot to get through in a short time. But I think at this point we're now going to hand over to our colleagues from BEIS, and starting with Tom Mole, who is kind of essentially responsible for the call for evidence process. Important I'm saying there, call for evidence, you'll notice, and I'm sure Tom will highlight that as well, that in the complex lexicon of policymakers and civil servants language, the call for evidence is quite a different thing to a consultation. Tom.
Brilliant, thanks Merlin. That's great. Really interesting to see the diversity of locations that people are in at the minute in the chat. It made me reflect. A lot of the time, or traditionally, we would have do these kind of events in London, and you would get a lot of people that live in London or locally in the southeast. But so it's a really good way of, I think, getting different views from all over the country. So that's really remarkable. Thanks. I mean, absolutely spot on with the introduction there. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for Regen for organising it. As Merlin said, my name's Tom Mole. I work in the Contracts for Difference policy team at BEIS. So I spend most of my time working on the government strategy to supporting renewable deployment, thinking particularly about how our support schemes and market designs can evolve to ensure that they remain effective at supporting renewable deployment and wider power sector decarbonisation. So I'm here today to talk about the call for evidence, which Merlin mentioned, which BEIS published back in December and is closing in 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks. And to put it in a bit of context, really, with the kind of wider policy environment and kind of recent publications that have come from BEIS and other government departments. So I'll try and keep it fairly brief, so we can kind of dive into the discussion, because I'm sure that'll be very interesting. I also don't have any slides, so to avoid you having to stare at my face for too long, I'll keep it fairly brief. So if we get going, I think it's probably worth stating or starting with some recognition of how far the sector has come in terms of decarbonisation already. So I've got a couple of facts here, and I think they're all in the call for evidence. But firstly, I think the amount of greenhouse gas emitted by the production of a kilowatt hour of power in Great Britain today is less than half of that emitted by one produced in 2012, which I think is pretty remarkable. Similarly, over the last decade, renewable power has gone from around 7% of the total power produced in the UK to over 37% today. Solar PV and wind now offer some of the cheapest means of producing electricity. And finally, the UK has established itself as a world leader in offshore wind deployment, with prices in the last contracts for difference auction coming in at just a third of what prices were seen as recently as 2015. So some really kind of staggering stats there, and I think we can all agree that overall it's pretty remarkable. But the reason I mention it specifically is that in many ways these advancements have formed the foundation of our current decarbonisation policies and objectives. The ability to deploy clean power at scale gives us that crucial, affordable path to net zero. And that brings us kind of where we are today in terms of policy and the kind of environment we're in. The end of last year saw the government really lay down a marker in terms of its decarbonisation ambitions. And certainly from the inside, it definitely feels like there's been a real step change here in terms of the prioritisation of those targets and of decarbonisation. So in December, the Prime Minister himself set out his 10-point plan to achieving a green recovery, announcing some, well, what I think are really quite ambitious decarbonisation policies, but also solidifying kind of climate measures at the heart of our economic recovery strategy from the pandemic. So, you know, really exciting time. And this was followed by the Energy White Paper, which built on the announcements in the 10-point plan and kind of corralled a lot of our decarbonisation policies together into what we hope is a clear and effective strategy to achieving net zero in the energy sector. So just kind of bring out a couple of the points from the white paper. Firstly, it focused on consumers and how decarbonisation needs to work for all consumers to be successful. It explained how decarbonisation relies on a decarbonised power sector with a strong push on CCUS and hydrogen for the sectors that might find it more difficult to electrify. And finally, it highlighted that the biggest chunk of this crucial low carbon power is likely to come from renewable sources. So I think that kind of sets out the context. We know that there's a kind of really big political will here. And we also have a reasonable understanding of what we need to target and achieve in terms of investment and deployment to get there and to reach net zero. So this is really where the call for evidence comes in. I mean, the CfD scheme and our current method of supporting kind of larger scale renewable deployment has been hugely successful so far, I think it's fair to say. And the government is committed to ensuring that this success continues. We've already set out the design of our next allocation round, which is due to open later this year. But we're also aware of the need to ensure our support schemes evolve with what is a rapidly changing market if they are to remain as effective as they are today. And it's not enough to think about renewable deployment in isolation. If it needs to work with the rest of the system, if it's going to maintain a kind of low cost decarbonisation trajectory. And I think that kind of thinking and is definitely where we're going in BEIS and externally, I'm sure. And I think that's symbolised by the fact that both myself from the kind of renewable side and Suleiman are here, and Suleiman's from the kind of flexibility and network side of BEIS. That also gives me somebody to deflect any particularly tricky questions to. But we appreciate that there are no easy answers here. When we talk about long-term design of renewable support schemes, they're intrinsically linked to the long-term design of overall energy markets for the reasons that we've touched on earlier. And that's a bigger problem, I think, than one team in BEIS can overcome, and indeed a bigger problem than the whole of BEIS can overcome, which is really why we wanted to start this conversation through the call for evidence with the sector to kind of really open it up for debate and kind of get the discussion going. So it's worth saying, I think, that this isn't about a large-scale revolution to the current schemes and particularly the CfD and wider energy markets. It's much more about how over time those schemes can evolve to make sure that they remain as successful as they have been up until now, and particularly over the past decade. I think we very much appreciate the scale of investment that is required to deliver a low carbon power system and net zero. And obviously, if we're going to achieve that investment, we're going to kind of need to retain confidence in the policies and the market framework. So I think that's kind of enough for kind of setting out the call for evidence. In terms of content, we identified 3 themes that we feel are key to ensuring success of our renewable support. And those three themes are maintaining investment, minimizing system costs, and supporting the overall innovative technologies and business models. So I was just going to touch on those three themes and just kind of give a kind of overall sense of the kind of things that we're looking to receive views on. So the first one around maintaining investment is really about us looking to understand the economic landscape and how that's likely to change in future, very much so. So we ask questions about where projects will earn revenue, how much revenue and how that is likely to change going forward, how viable unsupported deployment of different renewables technologies is, and by unsupported we mean kind of non-CfD backed renewables, but or low carbon technologies. But you know, there are many ways to kind of routes to market, and we're really interested in kind of understanding how the industry is viewing that. And that kind of leads on to kind of a pretty open question, I think, about the future of the CfD itself, you know, particularly how long the industry feels that CFDs need to be around for and should be around for if we're going to kind of reach an optimum deployment. And then there's some more broad questions in there around things like future market prices, particularly around themes like price cannibalization, which is quite an industry hot topic at the minute, and also around how market structures could evolve and change to better support our kind of decarbonisation and renewables ambitions. So that's the kind of first theme. Then the second theme is around minimising system costs, and it's kind of this really looks at the way renewables are brought onto the system and how they're brought onto the system impacts the rest of the system and the wider implications for it. And I always think it's quite striking that if we continue on our current path in terms of the way we're bringing forward renewables and the speed at which we're bringing forward renewables, then the majority of power generators in Great Britain by 2030 will be coming forward under the terms of the CfD contract, which definitely puts a rod up our backs in terms of making sure that those terms are correct and they deliver the right outcomes. And that's exactly what we want to kind of get views on and discuss in this part of the call for evidence. So we ask questions about market signals and striking the right balance between exposure to market signals, particularly price signals from wholesale markets, versus supporting investment in renewables through greater price certainty and insulation from those price signals. And then there is a balance there, and obviously there's going to be an optimum position kind of on that balance, but and we kind of want to get views and a range of views on where it's best to strike that balance. There's also questions in there around locational signals and whether they're correct in the current market framework, and whether projects are locating in the right places and will continue to relocate in the right places in terms of achieving our outcomes. This section also talks about how renewables can be brought forward alongside flexibility services, or at least in a way that doesn't hinder flexibility services coming onto the system. And this is something that Suleiman and I work quite closely on, and I've been doing a lot of thinking on, and I'm particularly interested in views on this as we kind of go on through the session. And equally, we talk about the balance of low-cost projects and low-cost power with the kind of objective of supporting UK economic growth, which is a particular priority, I think, for this current set of ministers, and there's kind of policy developments going through on that, particularly on supply chain plans on the contracts for different scheme, for example. And then finally, the last section is all about supporting innovative technologies and innovative business models. And this recognises, I think, that our current schemes are designed to support investment in and development of a kind of single new project with one technology being developed on one site. But I think we're increasingly aware that this is not always necessarily the most optimum way of supporting deployment. So this section has quite a few different questions in, particularly around co-locating generation and flexible assets. We ask about locating projects over different geographic sites, coordinating transmission connections. We ask about having more than one generation technology, so kind of onshore wind and a solar farm combining into one site. And we also ask about the implications for kind of part-built projects competing for government support and repowered assets, and how these projects might be brought forward to the market and how best to do that. And particularly with this section, what we're really trying to understand from the industry is what you guys are planning, what you guys are identifying as the kind of optimum solutions here, and we're particularly interested in the size of the pie, I guess, in terms of how much value is there in kind of evolving schemes to support a certain type of new business model or a new technology that we haven't come across before or haven't had to kind of really consider before. And that's kind of it really. That kind of concludes, and it's a very brief run through of what the call for evidence is asking about. So we'd be really keen for your thoughts and views on this, and I'm sure the discussion today is going to be a very interesting one. Particularly, you know, is there anything we're missing? Are we barking up any of the wrong trees? Merlin, you were very kind before and said that you know, a lot of the questions were the questions that Regen were thinking about, and kind of really important questions to ask. So that's also really reassuring, and it'd be good to discuss in more detail. And just to say that very much the success of the call for evidence will depend on how many responses we achieve. So the responses, I can definitely say, will influence how our policies develop in future. So I really hope that as many of you as possible are able to submit your responses before the deadline. However brief, you know, it doesn't have to be a response to every single question. We're interested in kind of getting a range of views and from a particularly diverse range of stakeholders. And that's it for me. I'll wrap it up there. I don't want to take too long. So I look forward to hearing thoughts from the rest of the panel and kind of discussing through the Q&A today. And I don't know, Suleiman, if you've got any views to add, particularly on the flexibility side as well. But I'll leave that to you guys.
Thank you, Tom. Let's hand over. Suleiman, do you want stuff you want to add?
Yeah, I won't add much. I think Tom's done a really good job of summarising the call for evidence generally, and we'll probably get into some of the more flexibility focused questions in the Q&A and the discussion. I guess just explaining sort of why I'm here, as Tom said, what we're really keen to do is to make sure that, as well as bringing forth a large amount of renewable generation onto the system, that we're thinking about how that new generation interacts with other parts of the system. What we don't want is to be, you know, bringing loads of low carbon generation onto the system, but then because of where it's located or system stability requirements, we're not able to make the best use of those assets because the ESO is having to intervene in the market. So as Tom mentioned, I come from the smart energy team, and particularly I'm head of the markets for flexibility part of that team. And really what we're interested in is just trying to make sure that the incentives that we're putting into the CFD match up with what we're trying to do to the system as a whole, so that we can, as I say, get the best use out of the assets that we're building through this.
Excellent. Suleiman, thank you very much. Just a quick kind of couple of questions before we hand over to the panel from myself. Probably personally for Tom, I just wonder about this kind of balance of, you know, big and medium and little. You know, that essentially the CFD scheme supports large projects. It'd be pretty hard to compete, I think, with a you know, you can go through that whole process and all the costs with a sort of medium and smaller scale. But over the last few years, actually, the kind of, you know, a few megawatts up to 50 meg type scale projects, and indeed decentralized, you know, and we've had it in the questions and chat already, you know, projects spread around the country, connected directly perhaps to sources of demand, play quite a big role and make a lot of sense, and it seems likely they're going to continue to do so. And there isn't really any government support scheme apart from CFD supporting very big projects at the moment. So I guess, you know, why is the government so obsessed with big stuff when in a world where we're decentralizing? Does that kind of, you know, does that sort of ring true as a challenge to basis thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, Merlin, and it's something that has been kind of leveled at the CFD before, and I think fairly, you know, if you look at the results of previous CFD rounds, as you say, it's generally been the bigger the project, the more economic and therefore the more competitive and therefore the more likely to win. I think from a policy perspective, what we're really trying to achieve, or certainly what we've been really trying to achieve up until now, is the kind of lowest cost route to decarbonisation, the lowest cost route to renewable deployment. And yes, traditionally that has been larger projects, but that not necessarily always going to be the case. And I also think that not necessarily the CFD in its current framework doesn't necessarily stipulate that that will be the case. I certainly take the potential criticism of the CFD being quite complex, and it does take quite a lot to engage with it and to kind of embark on the process of bidding in a CFD. And you know, that is something that ideally I think it would be reduced and it would be made more simple. But I think that we have to ensure that there is kind of a route to market for projects of all sizes, and very much the kind of smart export guarantee that came about, I think, in 2018, is very much that, allowing the very small scale projects to have a route to market. And I think BEIS will always be keen to make sure that as long as there's a route to market there, then the market itself will deliver the kind of optimum mix, I think, between small, medium and large projects and the various kind of benefits and value that they bring to the system. And certainly, you know, very much, I don't think it's as explicit in this call for evidence, but there's absolutely no reason why responses can't touch on that. And if we feel that balance isn't being struck optimally, then you know, absolutely, we're open to views on that.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Tom. So let's head to the panel now, and we are going to start with Ita. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Ita Kettleburgh, who is Deputy Director of the Energy Transitions Commission, and we've asked Ita particularly because the Energy Transitions Commission has been working on this question about, you know, a net zero power system on a global basis, thinking, you know, how do we achieve that across the world, and kind of putting forward various principles and approaches that they think, from the research they're doing and the work with quite an interesting panel, a commission there, which we've had some participation with. They've tried to derive some of the kind of principles, etc. So we thought we'd start by inviting Ita to give us the sort of conclusions of that work and how that might sort of feed in and colour the thinking of the UK at this position, where we go from sort of 40% renewables to kind of 80%, 100% kind of levels. Ita.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Merlin said, I'm Ita, the Deputy Director of the Energy Transitions Commission. So we're a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape. Just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the people that are on our commission, we have Aqua Power from the Middle East, we have Ørsted, we have Longji Solar from China, we have National Grid from the UK, Vattenfall, Iberdrola, Shell, BP. So on the energy side, we have quite a spectrum. We also have energy intensive industries and finance players, as well as civil society. So we have this very strong vision for a mid-century net zero economy, and it is electric. The future is electric. To give just a sense of scale, at a global level, we see that a net zero economy could require power system growth from order of magnitude 27,000 terawatt hours today globally to order of magnitude 100,000 terawatt hours in 2050. And of course, we need to decarbonize that power system as well. And at a global level, we're really convinced that it's possible for us to achieve this growth in the power system while simultaneously decarbonizing, primarily with renewables. That we see that high variable renewable systems are technically feasible and cost competitive at a system level, and that balancing challenges, particularly the long-term balancing challenges, can be overcome. We also, obviously, as was mentioned already from Tom, that the power system decarbonisation can and must run ahead of economy-wide decarbonisation. It's what enables you to decarbonise the wider economy, including the harder to abate sectors where you might need to use indirect electrification, green hydrogen, green ammonia, syn fuels, etc. The pace of growth we're talking about is very, very large, but we think it is feasible if it's anticipated. And so it will take forceful actions and strong policy to achieve what we want to achieve. We've actually spent much of the last year working with our members to try and understand what are those priorities, what are the priorities for the next decade that are required to enable that massive scale up in wind and solar generation in particular, and the development of high renewable systems. And many of those areas chime exactly with the areas that the BEIS that Tom that you've just taken us through, which is great to see as well, that we're kind of picking up the same pieces here. So just very quickly, the 6 key areas, the importance of long-term signals and clear strategic vision to provide industry with the confidence and drive acceleration of investment. So clearly the UK's 40 gigawatt target for offshore wind being a really good example of this, but also anticipatory investment mechanisms, especially for networks, being really important as part of that vision. If we're going to build this, what do we need to set up? Driving the uptake of electrification and energy efficient technologies to provide the confidence in the growth of demand. We believe we need to electrify more. That's the route to net zero. Actually making sure that the support for heat pump installation is there, that the infrastructure investment for EVs is there, that corporates themselves are making commitments. Third area, accelerating planning and permitting to support this rapid build. So, in the UK, an integrated vision of network development, avoiding the multiplication of individual connections, for instance, from wind farm to shore and offshore. That would be a really important part of what we need to do to allow us to scale at speed. And expanding use of the kind of one-stop shop models. Actually, the UK did this very well with offshore wind. Where else can we do that to really simplify plannings and approval processes? Continued focus in innovation and R&D, especially concerning long-term energy storage, creating the right investment environment to channel the massive amounts of low-cost capital into the power system growth, which most critically is appropriate market design, and finally investing in those core capabilities, so continuing to improve TSO capabilities to manage these high variable renewable grids, but also critically developing a kind of DSO type capability to manage the massively increased activity we're expecting at the distribution level. Just to kind of pick up on the point I think is perhaps most important for the UK, and which Tom, you flagged kind of extensively, just on this power market design, we've spent a significant amount of time in the last year reflecting on this with our members, really, recognising that variable renewable growth was driven by long-term contracts, the feed-in tariffs and the CfDs, but that the costs are declining, the need for subsidy is disappearing. However, I think we would really strongly say that the need for long-term price certainty is not. In a system dominated by high fixed costs, zero marginal costs, uncertain wholesale prices make short-term markets insufficient to incentivize the investments in generation that we need at the speed and scale we need them for the energy transition to meet a Paris-aligned target. So the missing money problem is real. And that alongside this, given the uncertain future prices for variable renewable generation, increase the investor returns required, which increases LCOEs, especially given the dominance of capital costs. So we would say very, very strongly that as the energy system transitions over the next 3 decades, we need appropriate energy capacity auxiliary services markets to ensure a level playing field for all zero carbon technologies. We certainly need strong incentives for deployment of flexibility, which I know we're going to come back to in the discussion. But we would also say we see a continued role for the long-term contract for energy to unlock that financing. And that critically, those long-term contracts must be really well designed to balance the need to ensure revenue certainty, but actually also to have a level of alignment to system needs. So for an example, we may be using reference prices based on technology-specific pricing, but at the same time use daily or weekly average settlement periods so that producers are still exposed to those system needs, can respond in terms of their generation, and also to encourage deployment. And one final thing that we think is really interesting to look at is also the use of auctions for energy delivered in given hours of the day or certain quarters of the year, based on what we think when and where the energy shortages could occur. And this has been done very successfully in Chile, and something we can think about, especially given long-term balancing challenges in the UK. So very, very excited to participate in the discussion today.
That's actually very helpful. Thank you, and it's interesting to reflect on those principles and to sort of score the UK against them. And your point about the long-term contracts and the design of long-term contracts isn't just a kind of one. Either you have them or you don't, but can be quite a lot of subtlety in the way that you design those, and that you ensure you get that you're buying what you actually want and need more specifically. also was pleased to hear reference to need of planning and the like. Perhaps going out on a limb that's suggesting that the Ministry of Local Government in the UK has perhaps been one of the last bastions of climate scepticism in government, but hopefully that I will be proved wrong. But that's an area, and some of the planning guidance, etc., particularly around onshore wind in England, is obviously an area that we don't quite have the system we'd like. Okay, so next up, I'm going to come to Lars. Some of you may longer in the tooth of engaging in government renewables policy. You might remember that the last big change in the design of the UK energy system that came in about 7 or 8 years ago, brought in CFDs and capacity markets and all this kind of stuff. We had many similar sessions to this where we happily went through what I think was about 80 different consultations during that period. And Lars starred in many of those consultation sessions and is still a very active player in the trading market. So we thought we'd come to that kind of perspective of how people actually get value in the market for their power and how government policy might change and affect that. Lars.
Thank you very much, Merlin. Yes, so when I moved to the UK, and I was there in 2013 and in the years up to then, when we started with the whole CFD design and the first implementation, back then we thought, oh my God, and then we have to do this against the market price and stuff like that, and how do we actually make that? And I would just take a moment to actually recognize what has been said before, that we have brought down the cost per megawatt hour from a level of 120, which was the first CFD round, to about 40. So a 2/3 decrease. And that was done by the whole system as a whole. I mean, BASE has learned a lot about how to implement subsequent small rule changes so that we were getting better and better at building larger projects and being able to bid in at the most competitive prices. The market has been able to offer more and more favorable conditions for developers of these CFD projects so that they could actually regain most, if not all, of their income in such a way that they could make their investment strategy work at these low prices. And I think that we are at a level where we should also say we have created something very valuable, and we've shown the rest of the world that this is something that can be done and can be done at a very competitive price. So from that point of view, I wanted to, my thoughts was, let's try to just maybe do a little small changes around the edges, but keep the underlying principles as much intact as we have. I do think that the UK still is situated in one of the best situations for creating a net zero energy system, and maybe even a net negative energy system where they're going to export additional renewable power to other countries that we have connected with via interconnectors. And some of those points that BASE is also pointing out in this call for evidence is, yes, let's just not further increase the responsibilities that projects can do. I personally believe that the rule that we now have, that you don't get CFD subsidy if the price goes below zero, I think that in itself is already an incentive to add batteries, so that the energy that you would be able to create doesn't go to waste. But even with the losses that you have in battery conversion, you would still make more than zero out of them if you're holding them for an hour later when the price goes above zero again. Another point is how can we co-design an offshore wind farm with an interconnector by, for example, stating that the owner of that asset will receive the CFD, but will only receive it and only has the obligations for the megawatt hours that are hitting the UK shores. That gives the owner of the CFD project the flexibility required to optimize their income stream. So by utilizing then the CFD revenues to also help other countries, so that the UK is actually not only providing green power for the UK system, but also for other systems. And then at the time when we do not have, or when the UK does not have enough renewable power, we can then import back from other countries at the time when we need it, so that we, over the whole scene, are still at a net zero level. I think that another point that is really interesting is that BEIS is actively encouraging to think about localization of where should those projects be. And of course, that is a very, very good point, because it doesn't make a lot of sense if we have a very, very low CFD price and we don't give a lot of subsidies to a project with regards to the CFD, but then we have to build for millions or maybe even billions of additional infrastructure just to get the power from point A to point B. Otherwise, the power cannot be utilized. There is not a really easy answer to that, but as our current company, Yggdrasil, we are trading also in the US market and in most of the European markets, and we can see that there is a merit to maybe let go of the unification of a UK power market. So by that I mean to say, okay, maybe we should look at having separate price zones for the UK. So we're saying, okay, if we cannot take out so much renewables out of the through the Scottish Highlands, maybe there should be a separate power price for Scotland, so that it becomes clear for new investors that they have a potentially lower power price in Scotland and therefore a potentially higher power price if they build in England, or especially around London and other large consumption centers. That would again also spur the investment of additional projects in those areas. And it would bring down the cost of connection, because you would not have to build more and more cables to just keep the singular price up and running. But over the whole, I think we have a system which works, and we should maybe keep it as close as possible. And just to say what Ida also said before, have a horizon which goes up to a decade or more, where BEIS would say, we're going to have round 5 in 2022, we're going to have round 6 in 2023, round 7 in 2024, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we foresee this happening until 2030, so that everybody can plan and bring their costs down.
Thank you very much, Lars. Just give us the name of your company again. You'll notice I didn't say that in introducing you.
Melon, I'm working for Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil is the Scandinavian name of the Tree of Life.
There you go, Tree of Life. That's what we'll call you, Lars from the Tree of Life. Much easier. I'm not sure if you'll still be working in Scotland after today, but you know that's at your own risk. Which it's a slightly serious point where physics and energy system demand and politics may start to overlap, as perhaps we've seen with interconnectors and Brexit and markets and things in recent times. Okay, so Matthew, you're next up, Managing Director of Thrive, long-term friend of Regen, of course, and an organisation that's probably thrived, focused on more of the medium and smaller scale projects, it might be fair to say, Matthew, and perhaps particularly well placed to think about what will the current system and the future system bring forward the volume of renewables that we need. Matthew.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so just by way of introduction for those that don't know Thrive, then we're a renewable investment company, and we typically invest between 1 and 15 million into each individual project. So we're typically building between the 1 megawatt and the 20 megawatt kind of space. We've built 28 projects in the UK to date, and we're currently building another 3, including a hydro and a couple of batteries. That portfolio currently generates enough electricity to power a third of the UK's EV fleet, or about the residential needs of a city the size of Worcester. So I guess when we've been reading the CFD news and the developments, and particularly this call for evidence, we're very much looking through that lens of, so we're not going to be building offshore wind farms ourselves. We're probably not going to be building 200 megawatt wind farms ourselves. So where do these developments leave us? So that's the lens, I guess, I'll be commenting from. And I think I would like to reflect, as others have, that if we were having this session 12 months ago, firstly, it would have been in person, which would have been nice. but also, at that point, there was no visibility of whether onshore would be included in the CfD or not. So brilliant. The offshore, onshore wind and solar is part of the CfD, and we're really thrilled about that. And also, there's a general sense, with the build-up, the combination of the 10-point plan, the energy white paper, and this consultation, etc. It feels like we might actually be venturing into a space where we can deliver the renewables revolution that's required in alignment with the government rather than despite them, which is quite a nice space to be in, having been in the sector for a few years so far. So really welcome where we are at the moment and the trajectory we're on. So I guess in terms of the main areas of concern from our perspective, I guess is that fundamentally to deliver as the volume of new capacity that we need to deliver net zero, I feel we need to transition from the marginal cost of generation setting the wholesale electricity price to the marginal cost of capacity. And we'll come into a bit more detail about that. I also think that it's important and crucial, and Merlin's touched on this, to align the planning guidance with the kind of scale of the opportunity and the requirement, the environmental imperative. So at the moment, I feel there's a little bit of conflict between CfD very much pushing us on a scale trajectory and the planning situation perhaps not pushing us on that trajectory. So I think that's something that we need to be unpicked. But I also think that one of the other areas which we really need to drill down to in this process and the evolution of the market is that role that demand side management can have. Just completely restructuring the relationship between demand and supply and balancing that relationship rather than supply being a slave to demand effectively. So yeah, so but I think I'll focus on the transition in terms of that long-term certainty and price signals that we need to be able to continue to build. So I guess, at the heart of that is we've got good visibility of the auction, which is planned for this autumn, but we haven't got, so the kind of volumes we're talking about seem sensible, though, if I'm being honest, feel a little bit light for the scale of the opportunity that we've got, or the scale of the change we need to bring about. But I think really the certainty, that visibility that Lars has just spoken about is absolutely crucial. If you think the development cycle for a lot of these projects, a quick turnaround for a project is 2.5 to 3 years from going to talk to a landowner to having planning consent. So when we're looking at the visibility and that appetite for delivery of this, I think we do need that trajectory, at least 5 years, preferably longer ahead of us, to be able to really start building and delivering the kind of levels of deployment we need to see. And I think that in some ways is evidenced by what happened when we lost the revenue certainty or that regulatory certainty in 2015, 2016, and we saw a 6-fold reduction overnight for the following 2 years in the amount of projects going into planning. So I think that the reverse is true. If we have that 5 to 10 years of certainty about when the auctions are going to be, the kind of the distribution between the pots and the kind of capacity that's required, then people can make informed decisions about the embarking on that development journey. And I think that the thing that really concerns me about the current structure is that, again, it depends on where the pots, the allocations to each pot fall. I'm really concerned that we're going to lose that lower end of scale. So, say if we drew the line at 20 megawatts, we could say, well, if the economies of scale suggest that we should be building bigger, better, and that will deliver power for less. But what we must remember is, if we draw that line at 20 megawatts, a third of everything that's been delivered in terms of renewables in the UK so far is sub 20 megawatts. And it has a material role to play. And if we look at the age profile, the maturity of that, then all of that power needs, all of those projects, so that third of the capacity we've got so far, needs repowering between now and 2035. So if we don't have a structure which gives us the long-term certainty, clarity, and an opportunity to continue to build those projects, then we've got a real problem with meeting net zero, because we're going to lose projects off the bottom of that from the existing heap. So I think that's something that we really need to focus on. And something I touched on at the beginning is this: the wholesale electricity price effectively, it provides a price which is the marginal cost of the cost of generation of the marginal project, or the marginal capacity which is delivered in that half an hour. And so that's quite volatile. That moves around a lot, that's a commercial reality. But I think that, you know, if we're going to deliver fourfold growth in this system, then that market needs to transition into to reflect the cost of capacity, rather than the cost of the marginal plant that's delivering that. And really, the CfD can do that, and almost the CfD is the marginal cost of capacity, and that's coming down really quickly, which is great news for all of us. But what I'm really concerned about is if the allocation isn't large enough to allow everything, or the whole capacity that we need to be delivering to be captured in those auctions, then anything that sits outside that, the price signal is going to be a really, really bleak place. Because effectively every trajectory that you look at, because there's so much of the system will be benefiting from CfD or other legacy incentives, and the wholesale market becomes a more and more distant relative of reality and what's required to build. So we really need to be conscious when we're setting up those allocation sizes and distributing that between the pots, that it's a very hostile, it could be a really hostile environment for projects which don't qualify for the CfD. And the other thing, I guess, that's worth saying is there are routes to market outside of the CfD. So we build a lot of private wire projects where we directly deliver power into sites, and there's also obviously the corporate PPA model. But I really feel that for the scale and the opportunity, we really need to be able to be addressing that sub 20 megawatt space and providing that comfort, because all the analysis suggests that by providing that price certainty, you can shave between £6 and £12 per megawatt hour out of your energy price. Now, for us all to benefit from that level of certainty needs to be applied to everything. Otherwise, again, anything that sits outside that is in a pretty hostile place. And I guess the other area that, looking backwards to see how we used to do this, when I started out energy trading many moons ago, we were routinely trading 5, 10, 15 years out forward contracts. And that, 15 years of forward trading would give us the opportunity to build, to take these really capital intensive decisions, get projects built and moving. But the reality is, with the CfD there and the other, with the FIT, the ROC and everything else, there hasn't been a need for that longer term proper market pricing or the forward market. So I think perhaps if we're going to have a CfD which excludes a slice of the market, then we really need to work out what market mechanisms we can put in place to be able to provide that longer term liquidity in the energy markets. So I guess just to conclude on this point, then, if the CfD is an opportunity for everything that needs to get built to benefit from it, then it's an incredibly powerful tool. If it's something which drives a line through that, and there are going to be assets and projects which are excluded from that, we really need to drill down into how we support that, make that happen, because it can be a material part of the portfolio that needs delivering. So there's just the last couple of points. On the planning side, as I touched on at the beginning, it feels like CfD drives scale. Planning currently drives the smaller the better, and the more discrete the better. So it's something we really need to address. And I think public opinion is very much, it's the best. We've got the most support as a sector that we've ever had for renewables and the consciousness around climate change and the need for net zero. So I think it's imperative that we take people on that journey. We learn the lessons from the last 15, 20 years and really engage with the public and individuals and make projects happen that way. The other side is on demand side management, as I touched on, touched on at the beginning. I think that all of our domestic heating and commercial heating and hot water needs need to be electrified if we're going to hit net zero. This creates a massive opportunity in terms of the change in relationship between demand and supply. 80% of residential energy needs come in the form of hot water and heating. If we're able to have all of that dynamic and working with the grid rather than against it, then we'd just need less capacity, and the cost would come down. We could drive that through potentially through time of use tariffs, which I know can be considered as a bad thing in terms of fuel poverty, but actually it could bring the cost of energy down for everyone. And if there were automated systems, the only freezers you could buy responded to grid signals. The only hot water tanks you bought would respond to hot water the grid situation. Then you could see a lot of progress there. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be done there. And I guess, and the other thing that we need to bear in mind when we're looking at all of this is, there isn't there's so much capital chasing renewable energy, sustainable energy, which is a terrific position to be in. But I guess but we need to be conscious as a nation that a ton of CO2 emission reductions is the same wherever in the world it's delivered. So we need really concrete, confidence building market design and structures in the UK to make sure that investment comes to the UK and allows us to meet our net zero targets. And also, one of the things that I don't want to happen over the next 5-10 years is, over the last 10 years, the UK's built a really rich fabric of individual, community, crowd participation in the energy space. And I think it's really important that if we're going to deliver the scale of change that we need to do, we need to take everyone with us. And I think that we really need to make sure we don't exclude that sub 20 megawatt space through this process.
Excellent. Matthew, there's some very powerful points there. I'm going to move straight on, keen to get everything in we can, to Mike from Habitat, who's very focused on storage and is going to kind of focus on the flex element of the conversation that we're having here. Mike.
Thanks for that, Merlin. So yeah, I'm Mike Ryan. I'm the UK Commercial Director at Habitat Energy, and we provide algorithmic and machine learning routes to market for storage, primarily battery lithium-ion storage at the moment, though we are also optimizing a small amount of solar. I'm trying to work out how to respond to all this in the tight timescales Merlin's given me, because there's a really interesting conversation and already some great comments being made by the other panelists. So I thought I'd talk about perhaps the two elements of this consultation that haven't been discussed in as much detail. The first around system costs and how we keep system costs low, and the second around innovative new technologies and how we make sure that new tech can take part in this. The pace and growth required here is just incredible, isn't it? I mean, the scale we need to get to and the timescales we have to do it in are phenomenal. We've achieved huge things over the last 10 years, but we definitely need to just put our foot on the gas even harder to continue to streak ahead in the way we want to and the way we need to. Ita mentioned that, she sees long-term contracts for energy as being a requirement. I think that's right. I think having some exposure to wholesale market within that long-term contract structure would be incredibly beneficial, although the design would inevitably be somewhat complex. But I think one of the key facts about the way our energy market works at the moment is that it's a pure energy market. When you're building any form of technology and you're selling it into these markets, you are selling megawatt hours, kilowatt hours, gigawatt hours. There is no direct exposure to the costs you're incurring on the system. I thought Lars was very brave when he effectively mentioned locational marginal pricing, but Merlin beat me to the joke on that one. That may be a bit too extreme a move from where we are now, although I don't think it's something we should rule out. There needs to be some way of exposing any technology to the costs it incurs on the system. Now, this shouldn't necessarily be at the individual asset level. So I'm not saying that a wind farm, when it's built, should suddenly be exposed to all of the constraint costs that it may contribute to, or the fact that it's helping to reduce inertia on the system. But there should be some way where, if you were to make that asset more flexible, if you were to either add storage or some other technology that enabled it to mitigate some of those effects, or even act as a net benefit to the system, that it's relatively easy for that system as a whole, call it co-located, call it hybrid, whatever you will, is able to access that revenue stream. Now, there's lots of talk at the moment about being able to do this, about being able to co-locate sites and the benefits that will bring. But as always, the devil's in the detail, and even things as fundamental as the way the metering arrangements are currently set up in this country make it incredibly complicated for a co-located site to actually access those revenue streams. It's why we're seeing this great growth in storage at the moment, particularly battery storage, but we're not really seeing co-located sites explode. Now, clearly, co-located sites are the most efficient way of doing this. If you're building a large solar farm, for example, you're using your connection, you're using that piece of transmission or distribution infrastructure to export your power, but on the solar site, you're actually using that for a very small fraction of the time, which means we as a nation and as consumers have helped invest in that distribution or transmission asset for it to have, maybe a 10, 15, 16% utilization factor. Now, if we co-locate, then great, suddenly you're getting that utilization factor up because you have an asset that is able to use the transmission or distribution connection at times when solar are not. So I think it's really about making sure that we expose sites to system costs, but in a way that the sites can be developed to actually turn those costs into opportunities, a revenue stream that they can access, and a way that they can assist the grid rather than constantly be seen as something that's making the system more complex to handle. I think the same is true with locational issues. So one way to do it is, as suggested, you could just say, right, we're going to go to locational marginal pricing, and if you're in an area that's highly constrained, the price is going to be lower. Another way is to enable assets to actually take advantage of those locational restrictions. If there is value in absorbing energy behind a constraint, well, then let assets access that value. It ultimately reduces costs to the end consumer and enables higher levels of renewable generation to be installed in those geographic regions. So must be a great thing. And we've really got to work out a way to unpick that. Again, the way the codes are written right now, certain elements of generation licenses and TCLC, in a way say that, well, this really shouldn't be the done thing. But it's something that storage is absolutely designed to help with. And it's far better to do that than say, actually, what we're going to do is build a transmission or distribution network that can constantly cope with the peak whenever that occurs, the peak generation output. Then the final one I just wanted to mention then is around co-locating or tri-locating technologies. Within any kind of CFD mechanism, I think we really need to find a way of allowing those sort of technologies to compete. I'm not saying they should be given an advantage. I'm not saying that there should necessarily be a specific uplift because you've located, but there should be no downside to a renewable site that decides they want to install storage of some kind on the network. The issue right now is with the way it's structured, there's potential that you lose some of those CFDs or other incentives that are in place. And again, unfortunately, it comes down to real boring details, or boring to me anyway, around how metering works, how data flows run. And it's only when you get into that nitty gritty that you really manage to unpick some of these issues. I do think this is all achievable though, and I think it's all achievable in the timescales we're looking at. But the one thing we can't afford to do is delay.
A good point to end on. Absolutely agree with that one. Mike, I picked up a couple of points. Boring details, being all comes down to the boring details. It's always a good one. And foot on the gas. We're going to have to think of another phrase, aren't we? Perhaps in the chat function, someone can tell us the net zero equivalent of foot on the gas. Right. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of fascinating, quite complex areas. And so luckily now we have Johnny from Regen to sum it all up for us and tell us the answer. Johnny.
Thanks very much. Merlin. We have covered a lot of ground, and I can sense that you're itching to get onto the Q&A session. So I will. I'll be very quick on this. I guess I'm sort of approaching this call for evidence with a degree of excitement and trepidation in equal measure. Trepidation partly because I did spend 3 years pretty much going through the last EMR consultation, which led to the CFDs and the capacity markets. And we've had a few comments about devil in the detail, and I can remember just going through there was 80 odd, as you mentioned, Merlin, consultations. I think at one point I replied, "I give up. I'm exhausted by this and cannot comment anymore." But I'm also slightly trepidation, because I do agree with what Lars said about, we have made it so far. We've done very, very well in terms of electricity deployment. The CfD process has worked after a fashion, albeit really for offshore wind. And there is a sense in which, particularly for the short term, with the pipeline of projects that we've currently got ready to go, what we should be looking to do is making the current system work, and making it work, as Matthew said, for a range of technologies and for some of those smaller scale technologies as well. And actually, when I think back to the original design of the CfD, I mean, it wasn't intended to be a scheme that only applied for very large projects in offshore wind. I can remember having a discussion with BEIS at the time about whether we should be running auctions on a quarterly or a 6-monthly basis, and discussing the various pots and the minimas and maximas within those pots that would encourage a wide range of technologies to come forward. So in many ways, I feel as if the CfD, it's not so much the design of the system, but the way in which the system has been applied that has really focused on offshore wind to the exclusion of solar and onshore wind and other emerging technologies as well. And part of that is taken up with the politics that obviously emerged around 2015, and the decision to effectively, withdraw support from onshore wind, and the fallout from that with collateral damage, which affected other technologies then that were tied up in the same pot. So I do think there's a lot that we can do within the current mechanism, and I think the detail is around how can we make sure that all technologies compete for those contracts for difference, and making sure that we get it right in terms of, well, what scale are we trying to support? And a very important point was made by Matthew and by Ita as well, is that projects that are outside of the CfD, what mechanism is in place to support those? And I think we do need to think about, there's a discussion there about long-term trading, for example. The corporate PPA market is another route which I think could be very much invigorated and actually held up as an alternative route to market. A couple of things weren't mentioned in the previous discussions. I just want to touch on maybe sort of foundations for the new market. And one of them that we've been talking about in Regen quite a lot is a carbon price. I mean, at the moment, the environmental levies that are applied to electricity very much works against electricity. We think that should be redesigned immediately into some form of carbon levy. But that carbon price, and I think now is the time to talk about a carbon price, a universal carbon price applied at a meaningful rate that would underpin the market for electricity, would encourage the uptake of PPAs, encourage the uptake of long-term supply agreements, and also potentially reinvigorate the REGO, the much maligned REGO that we've maligned many times as well, which is the certificate that comes with renewable energy, which can carry with it a degree of the value of greenness, which is clearly not working at the moment and is barely made any material impact at all in terms of investment, but could be reinvigorated. There was a discussion about locational signals, and I call them locational signals rather than just price signals, because we really need to look holistically at the locational signals that we're giving. At the moment, within the world of Ofgem and network charging, locational signals tend to be wholly about the network cost signals that we need to give, certainly not the system cost signals, or how do we get to the lowest cost decarbonisation. And of course, alongside those price signals, we're also giving very negative planning signals. So there's no point in us coming up with a new scheme to give price signals to say, build your wind farms in the south of England, while at the same time we're giving completely negative planning signals to say, don't even bother thinking about it. So I think we have to look holistically at the overall signals that we're giving. I think location is important. I mean, I'm coming at it from a renewables point of view. I mean, the wind blows where the wind blows, and there are ideal spots for renewable energy projects. So I think we need to have a little bit of balance around that and think about, well, what other measures, what other investments can we make to make those projects work? And so, Mike's point about co-location of storage and Lars' point about flexibility is absolutely right. I mean, we need to be looking at those markets and encouraging that co-location either on site or co-location within the same zones within the network that can reduce those overall costs. I mean, at the moment, we're giving completely the wrong signals. So if we look at the price signal we're proposing to give from the new TNUoS charging, the transmission network charging, where we will be charging energy storage devices in Scotland on the basis that they will be discharging in peak demand periods and therefore will pay the same price as a generator is giving exactly the wrong signal. And I mean, it's notable how few energy storage projects have actually been deployed in Scotland, even though from any other measure in terms of arbitrage or in terms of the balancing mechanism, that would be an ideal place to deploy those projects. So we're obviously doing something wrong there around that. The question of price cannibalization was brought up, and I don't think there's any real way of getting away from it. I mean, we either give projects revenue security, and that's great, and that will encourage investment to come forward, or we expose them to the wholesale market, in which case we need to deal with this issue about price cannibalization. I think the problem can be shrunk quite a lot. I mean, if we think about storage, we think about much more flexible demand side, as Matthew mentioned, around a demand side response and time of use tariffs and dynamic tariffs around that. We need to think about interconnectors. I mean, the whole thing of what's happened in Texas and what's happened here in the UK since Brexit is really interesting about interconnectors, but that is a way in which we can sell our low cost electricity into the European market and help to displace, you know, coal-fired power stations in Poland, which is something that we ought to be working towards. And we also need to think about the sort of multi-vector opportunities of which, you know, hydrogen electrolysis, I think, can play a role in that as well. So if we can create new markets for electricity, I think we can certainly reduce that price cannibalization risk, because there'll always be a demand for low-cost energy if we can find the market for it. We can also encourage the PPA market as well and long-term supply agreements, which helps to isolate generators from that risk. And then what's left, we probably will need to look at some form of support, either based on capacity or based in terms of a Isa's point was very interesting about time of generation or month of generation or seasonal pricing, which would be really interesting around that. So I think there's a lot to play for. I'm imagining that what the chaps at BEIS are thinking of is that there are some short-term things we need to do, particularly in the next decade, to get us to the fourth and fifth carbon budget target, and then there's some longer things we need to do beyond that. I think that's right. I think keeping the momentum going at the moment is absolutely critical. And there was a comment made about signals and vision. We've got a very strong signal and vision, but only about one particular aspect of the technology, which is offshore wind. We need to get equally strong signals and visions about the rest of renewable energy and the flexibility markets as well. I think I'll leave it at that, Merlin, to let you get onto your Q&As.
Johnny, thank you very much. In a sense, in this online world, the Q&A goes on all the time, I guess. But a lot in there. I think what we'll do at this point is come back to our colleagues at BEIS, who are hopefully been able to listen and also digest some of the questions that are coming in. And Tom, I was going to particularly just ask your reflection. It was kind of an issue I picked up on a bit before, but Matthew put it much better than me. The sort of, is the vision that all the renewables we'll need will be bought by using CFDs, possibly, as Johnny suggested, quite significantly changed CFDs in the future, in which case fine, or are we expecting quite a lot of significant amounts of capacity to come from outside the CFDs, which Matthew described as being a pretty cold place to be, or certainly the risk that it becomes a pretty cold place to be. How do you see that, Tom?
That's a really good question, Merlin, and one that I do not have the answer to. And very much the purpose of the call for evidence is to really kind of tease that out. It's such a fundamental question, and something that even the white paper touched on. And I think it very much plays into this real kind of philosophical even question about what is the optimum way to decarbonize. Is it kind of centralized decision making by government and by kind of central organizations, or is it a more market-based driven system? And I don't think there is necessarily a right or wrong answer, but one of them is definitely optimal, or at least a balance somewhere is optimal. And as you say, it's a golden question, and we are hoping that this call for evidence will go towards answering that. I think at where we are at the minute, almost all renewables that have come forward recently have been under the CFD. We've seen a bit of a kind of merchant deployment or corporate PPAs, but the majority have been CFDs, and there is a very good question as to whether that is optimal moving forward, especially when we're talking about the ranges that we're seeing. But that's a very waffly and uncommittal answer, but it's genuine, because I don't have the answer to that question.
Okay, so there's let's also ask Suleiman if there's any particular things that you've picked out from the responses. We've had quite a lot of comments from the panel about ensuring there is value and flexibility, enabling co-location of storage, and there's a mix of price signals and doing some of the kind of detailed, boring details about enabling these technologies to come forward, and just the sort of clarity of market signals to enable assets to provide the right services to the grid at the right time, and the importance of those. Did any of that surprise you, Suleiman?
No, none of it surprised me, which is good to know that there's no real curveballs in that particularly. I'll pick up on a few things. There are lots of great points made. I'll try to be relatively concise in some of my answers. One is to pick up one of the last points which was made on where government are at. And sorry, I can't remember the name of the last speaker.
Johnny.
Yes, that's right. Mentioned that we're kind of in this phase of looking at things which we can do in the medium to short term, but also trying to straddle that with the forward-looking strategy stuff. And I think what you'll probably see both in this call for evidence and also in the smart systems and flexibility plan that we have coming out in spring is us constantly trying to get that balance of keeping one foot in the detail to sort of the very technical sort of metering sort of questions and things like that, which you mentioned, but also keeping one eye on where are we headed with this? What's the general strategic direction? So even if we can't give concrete answers on that yet, it's where we're kind of, we're leaning between the two. On co-location and flexibility more general, I thought the point that the energy market is just that, it's an energy market, was a really good point, and that at the moment our structure is trying to pick up those other bits of the system costs in other markets. So, we have things like the DNO flex tenders and also some of the ESO Pathfinder projects, which are trying to capture some of that value in other places. And I guess the contracts for different scheme is another place where it's sort of an add-on to the market where we could allow for some of these things to be valued, but there's still questions of the best way to do that. On co-location, it's interesting to see people talk about co-location so much. It's something that we know is potentially important. I think at the moment, my kind of thinking is that what's really important is the flexibility aspect. And sometimes co-location will be an efficient way to do that. And where it is, we need to address those barriers that you mentioned around data flows and metering to make sure that there at least aren't things which are stopping people from co-locating when they want to co-locate. But also we need to think about flexibility and minimizing system costs as being about a lot more than just co-location. That's one tool that we have in our arsenal to make sure that we're getting the best use out of these assets, but there are lots of other things that we could do as well. I think someone referenced virtual power plants, which is the idea that we don't need to have the assets physically located if they're providing sort of a counterbalancing service elsewhere on the system. So those were some of the key things that I noticed. Also, there was something on the demand side, which again, I completely agree with, probably slightly out of the scope of some of the CFD conversation, but it's something that we're looking at a lot in the smart team. We've got a demand side response team, and you're right that particularly as transport, as heat or electrified, those are going to be, on the one hand, obviously a huge burden on the grid, but on the other hand, a huge opportunity, because if we can make those things behave in flexible ways, that's a whole nother source of flexibility that we didn't have in the system previously. So I'll pause there because I'm sure there are other questions that you may want to throw to people as well.
Yeah, one of the things I'm seeing coming up quite a lot is the kind of focus on, let's say, joined up government beyond just the beyond just thinking just about energy markets, but we've heard about talking about planning, and Johnny pointed out the kind of that you might have you might start to have signals that suggest putting a technology in one place in the country because of the energy markets, electricity markets, but that might clash with our kind of the approach in planning, and more specifically, we've heard quite a lot about access to the network and how people can connect to the network and the cost structures of that. And there's various there's an Ofgem review at the moment. We're waiting for their minded to decision of access and forward-looking charges, and who pays what to access the network and how much they use it. And Johnny brought out TNUOS charges as an example of that. So from a commercial perspective, from someone trying to connect and engage with the network, they're thinking about all of these things. And of course, within government, they often tend to be rather split up between different departments, different responsibilities. And it does feel like, particularly in the case of the regulator, they're still thinking pretty narrowly around network costs rather than kind of whole system value. So just Suleiman, any
Yeah, I'll jump in there. First of all, with the caveat that I always have to do that, charging is definitely a matter for Ofgem. Having said that, we work very closely with Ofgem at the moment and are working very closely with them on our smart systems and flexibility plan. So I think, as you noted, there's a more joined up approach both within BEIS at the moment, as we seem to, in all of these different work streams, see more and more connections between them in a net zero world. I would say that that's also true of ourselves and Ofgem, that we've been working more closely with Ofgem to make sure that, because obviously, as you say, charging and access is absolutely crucial to the signals that we're sending people in terms of connections. And at the moment, that's one of the main ways that we're passing on sort of some of the locational price signals, with flex markets going on top of that. So obviously I can't preempt what will come out of that charging review, but I will say that there's definitely a lot of conversation around flexibility, whole system costs, thinking about it more holistically as what we want from the system, rather than, I know people often talk about TCR being one that was very just focused on the technical details. I do think that for the next sort of smart plan phase of work, we're able to zoom out and connect stuff that's happening in access and charging to what's happening in, say, flexibility markets.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to come around the panel for a kind of last comment. I'm going to sort of probably guide them as to which of the sort of topics and questions to pick up on. So let's start with Mike, particularly around that issue. Mike, I'm sure you're dealing with the complex interplay of different markets and value streams and BEIS and the regulator. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the risk of people at Regen and the ESM being fed up of me talking about this one, it is a huge problem, and everything needs to be much more aligned. And I don't see any other way of doing that now, other than saying, actually, we do need some new form of organization. Now, we've had the recent review into the system operator, going from legal separation to, it looks like, a full independent system operator. If I could wave my magic wand, I would also give that, whatever it may be, that organization a whole load of powers that Ofgem currently have, and potentially some powers from BEIS, I'm afraid, and have it as a single point where, if you want to know how much it's going to cost, in terms of network charges to connect to a DNO versus the TO, well, they're the person you go to. They also know the benefits or the costs from a system side of having an asset connected on the distribution network or the transmission network. They would have the overall plan of what it is we're trying to get to and how we get there at lowest cost and decarbonising the network. At the moment, to do all that, you have to get the policy from the minister that BEIS then try and interpret, who they pass on to Ofgem. Ofgem then tries to regulate National Grid, but without, no fault of their own, any technical understanding or any of the data that National Grid has. The market's trying to deliver net zero. National Grid's saying, well, it's not our responsibility to deliver net zero, and nor is Ofgem. And then we wonder why everybody's in a mess and getting really frustrated with trying to progress. I think we've got to a point where we just need one authority who's kind of the linchpin in all this and is able to make those decisions that need to be made. Some of them will upset people in the industry, and some of them will make people in the industry very happy. But we just need somebody or some organisation that has the authority to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. I'll mention for Johnny the Regen's paper on the future of the energy networks last year, or is it even more than a year ago now, where we called for that. Maybe someone from the Regen team will put in a link. There's a nice diagram there where we set out our view of the one agency to rule them all. And I've noticed KPMG also talking about that recently, but we definitely seem to be moving a little bit in that direction with the independent system operator stuff as well. Okay, let's we're pressed for time, so I'll ask for a very quick comment. I'm going to come to Ita. Listening to the UK squabbling amongst itself and down in some of the detail, is this just us getting into the necessary complexity that actually comes when you really try and move to a high renewables net zero system around network charging, et cetera, as well as markets and regulation, or are we over in the usual UK way, overcomplicating life, and we should just stick to some nice clean principles?
I think in many ways, I mean, to just echo the voices that have said earlier how remarkable, what the UK has done and the level of renewables that the UK has managed to bring onto the system, especially some of the levels we're seeing now over this last year, somewhat due to COVID as well. But so I think the UK can and should feel proud of what it's achieved so far, but also recognize the scale of the challenge, the scale of the climate situation that we are, part of not just part of the solution, we are the bulk of the solution too. And therefore kind of recognize that another step change is probably required. So what has happened so far has been good, but I think that recognizing that we need to kind of re-engage again on how we do this at the speed and scale, bringing in the level of private capital that we need to start flowing into these markets very, very quickly. It's important that we don't, yes, we should absolutely engage with the complexities, but we shouldn't get lost in them, and we need to think about doing this at another level again than has happened so far. So I think that kind of strategic vision and that commitment to where we're going to and the speed that we have to do it is really critical to guide all the way through the system and allow those aligned incentives through the chain of actors that Mike just took us through.
Excellent. So yeah, ambition, get on with it, deal with the detail, but don't get lost in it. Lovely. Lars, any last comment perhaps from yourself about, particularly around the kind of design and the system, and whether is we've got something like 10 gigawatts of solar projects in the pipeline in the UK. Are they going to get built if they can't get CfDs? You've got 1 minute.
Yes.
Okay, that was 1 second. And
yes, they will. Very simply because what you will see already now, if you look at the CfD round 3 price outcome, if they would have been producing over the last 2 or 3 months, they would have to pay subsidy. They wouldn't have received subsidy. The power market price was higher than the subsidy level that they get. So what I think what will happen is, yes, CfD clearly has wind as a winner so far, mostly offshore wind, but there are solar and wind are complementary. So in the hours in which there is not wind power, the power prices should be higher, and those are typically the hours in which solar should produce. And especially when the price of batteries will fall, as they have been, you will capture higher and higher prices with a solar generator. So I can only foresee a bright future for solar.
Okay, excellent, very specific, good question. Matthew, you have 30 seconds left. Are you reassured by Lars there?
Not yet. I think that, yeah, I just think the scale of the repowering that needs to go on, we really need to focus on. And I just think that we should really focus on the hostility of the environment outside the CfD in the market design. And I appreciate the comments that have been made around it's 2 phases. Let's get this done, and then we can move on to the next system. But the reality is, we're going to live with 15 to 20 years of legacy impact on the underlying market from each of these steps. So actually making decisions in the next 2 years will be the ones that are driving what's being built in 2035, 2045. And we really need to deliver net zero if we're going to sustain our existence.
Well, I couldn't end on a better note than that, Matthew. So you know, I'm definitely not going to try and sum up in less than 30 seconds. I have left the everything we've heard today. I think what we are hearing is that there are some big issues that we really need to think about carefully in terms of if we're going to get from where we're at 40% towards a net zero, genuinely high renewables net zero electricity system. And this is a key time to engage. So I would encourage everyone to respond by the 8th of March with any thoughts you had, and give Tom and Suleiman and their colleagues your thoughts. As you know, if there's not going to be very much point in a few years complaining about the system not working when they've come to us and asked us for our views about it. So we kind of got to, you know, this is the time to respond. And of course, you can also Regen will be responding. We'd love to see your responses, and we'd love to have you on board as members and joining and working to us on these kind of critical issues. So I think on that note, only remains for me to thank very much our speakers, to thank Bays for coming along and participating. Obviously, I'm going to be busy, but we'll be sending them your chat in order to feed into their consultation. I'm not sure if that counts officially, but there we go, we'll get that. And to thank Ita, Lars, Matthew, Mike and Johnny for their thoughtful responses. If you want to listen to them again, we'll put up the session, will go up on our website for you to go through, or if you missed any. And I shall just thank all of you for participating, for coming in, and of course all of your hard work on the energy transition and the journey to tackle climate chaos and to achieve zero carbon. Thank you very much, everyone.